The Harappan weightmakers, close your eyes now and let your breathing slow and deepen. Feel yourself sinking into comfort as we journey back through time, back over 4,000 years, to a place of wonder and mystery. We're traveling to the ancient Indus Valley, where the great cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro once thrived along the fertile riverbanks. The year is 2500 BCE, and the world is young, filled with the gentle sounds of a civilization that valued harmony, precision, and balance above all else. In this peaceful time, in the quiet workshop district of Harappa, there lived a master craftsman named Kavi. His hands, weathered and wise from decades of patient work, moved with the rhythm of the ages as he shaped small stones into perfect weights. Each morning, as the first light of dawn painted the brick walls of his workshop golden, Kavi would begin his sacred work. The workshop was a sanctuary of calm. Smooth clay floors, polished to a gentle shine, reflected the soft light that filtered through carefully placed windows. Along the walls, neat shelves held rows of completed weights, each one a small masterpiece of precision. They ranged from tiny seed weights, no larger than a grain of barley, to substantial trade weights that could measure a merchant's most precious goods. The architecture of the workshop itself spoke to the Harappan love of order and functionality. The walls were built from perfectly fired bricks, each one exactly the same size, laid in patterns that had remained unchanged for generations. The ceiling was supported by wooden beams cut from cedar trees that grew in the distant mountains, their aromatic scent lending a subtle fragrance to the air. Small channels built into the floor allowed for proper drainage during the monsoon season, while cleverly positioned windows provided natural ventilation that kept the workspace comfortable even during the hottest days of summer. Kavi's apprentice, a young woman named Mira, would arrive each morning just as the city began to stir. She moved quietly through the workshop, her footsteps barely whispering against the clay floor as she prepared the day's materials. There was something deeply soothing about these morning rituals, the careful arrangement of tools, the gentle sorting of stones, the quiet preparation for another day of mindful creation. Her daily routine was a meditation in itself. First, she would light the oil lamps that provided additional illumination for the finest work, their warm flames dancing gently in the still air. Then she would check the moisture content of the air by observing a specially prepared piece of wood that would expand or contract based on humidity levels. This was crucial information, as it affected how the stones would respond to their tools and how long the finished weights would need to dry. Next, Myra would examine each tool carefully, checking for any signs of wear or damage that might affect the precision of their work. The bronze chisels needed to be perfectly sharp, their edges honed to exact angles that had been refined over centuries of use. The wooden mallets required inspection for cracks or splinters that could cause them to strike unevenly. Even the measuring implements, the carefully calibrated strings and rulers, needed daily attention to ensure they remained accurate. The stones themselves came from the distant mountains, carried down by traders who understood their special properties. Some were dense and dark, hewn from volcanic rock that had cooled slowly in the earth's depths over millions of years. These stones were prized for their uniformity and hardness, qualities that made them ideal for weights that would see heavy use in busy marketplaces. Others were pale limestone, smooth as river pebbles, quarried from cliffs where ancient seas had once deposited their treasures layer by layer, century by century. Each type of stone had its own personality, its own quirks and characteristics that an experienced craftsman learned to read and work with. The volcanic stones were predictable but unforgiving. They would break cleanly when struck properly, but could shatter unexpectedly if the force was applied at the wrong angle or with the wrong timing. The limestone was more forgiving, allowing for corrections and adjustments, but required a gentler touch and more patience to achieve the finest finishes. There were also stones of intermediate hardness, sandstones from river valleys, granite from mountain peaks, and occasionally rare stones from lands so distant that their origins were wrapped in mystery and legend. Mira learned to identify each type not just by sight, but by touch, by sound, even by scent. A master craftsman could tell the source of a stone simply by the way it felt in their hands or the note it produced when tapped gently with a bronze tool. Myra would select each stone with careful attention, feeling its weight in her palm, sensing its potential. The art of weight making required not just skill, but intuition, an ability to see within the rough stone the perfect weight it was meant to become. She learned to read the subtle variations in color and texture that told her where the stone would be strongest, where it might split if struck incorrectly, where natural flaws might lie hidden beneath the surface. This process of selection was never rushed. Mira might spend an entire morning examining stones for a single important commission, turning each candidate over in her hands, studying it from every angle, sometimes even sleeping on her decision before making a final choice. Kavi had taught her that the selection of the right stone was half the battle in creating a perfect weight. Choose well, and the rest of the work would flow naturally. Choose poorly, and even the most skilled craftsmanship could not compensate for the stone's inherent limitations. Under Kavi's patient guidance, she began each weight by marking it carefully with a piece of soft copper. The lines had to be precise, for there was no room for error in this work. A weight that was even slightly incorrect could disrupt trade, could cause disputes between merchants, could upset the careful balance that kept their society functioning smoothly. The marking process itself was an art form, using specially prepared copper styluses that had been shaped and sharpened to create lines of exact thickness. Mira would trace the outline of the weight-to-be directly onto the stone's surface. These lines served as both guide and constraint, defining the boundaries within which she would work. The copper was soft enough not to damage the stone, yet firm enough to leave clear, visible marks that would not fade or smudge during the long process of shaping. Different types of weights required different marking techniques. Simple cubic weights needed only basic geometric guidelines, but more complex shapes, cylinders, truncated spheres, or weights with special features for easy handling, required elaborate preliminary sketches that mapped out every curve and angle. Mira learned to visualize the three-dimensional form while working with two-dimensional guidelines, a skill that required both mathematical understanding and artistic vision. The shaping process was a meditation in itself. Using tools of bronze and hardened wood, Mira would chip away tiny fragments of stone, each tap deliberate and controlled. The sound was rhythmic, almost musical, a soft percussion that blended with the distant sounds of the city. Children playing in the courtyards, merchants calling their wares, the gentle lowing of cattle returning from the fields. The rhythm of the work was hypnotic. Tap, tap, tap. Pause to examine the progress. Tap, tap, tap. Pause to brush away the stone dust. Tap, tap, tap. Pause to check the measurements. Each sequence was perfectly timed, following patterns that had been developed over generations of craftsmen. The pauses were as important as the action, allowing time for careful evaluation and preventing the rushed mistakes that could ruin hours of careful work. The tools themselves were marvels of specialized engineering. The bronze chisels came in dozens of different shapes and sizes, each designed for specific tasks. Wide, flat chisels for removing large amounts of material quickly. Narrow, pointed ones for detailed work and fine adjustments. Curved chisels that could shape concave surfaces with precision. Each tool was balanced to feel comfortable in the hand during long hours of use, and each was maintained with the care that a warrior might give to a treasured weapon. The wooden mallets, too, were carefully crafted instruments, made from hardwoods that had been seasoned for years. They were shaped to deliver exactly the right amount of force with each blow. Too heavy, and they would be tiring to use and difficult to control. Too light, and they would require too many strikes to accomplish the work, increasing the chance of errors. The handles were carved to fit comfortably in the hand, with subtle curves and ridges that provided a secure grip, even when hands became sweaty from long hours of concentration. As she worked, Kavi would tell her stories, of the old days when his own master had taught him these same techniques. He spoke of the great standardization, a time when the wise leaders of their civilization had decreed that all weights should follow the same system. No longer would traders from different cities use different measurements. No longer would there be confusion in the great marketplaces. This standardization had been one of the greatest achievements of their civilization, Cavey explained. Before it, trade had been hampered by countless local variations in weights and measures. A pound of grain in one city might be completely different from a pound of grain in another. Merchants had to carry conversion tables and employ specialized clerks just to navigate the maze of different measurement systems. The process of standardization had taken generations to complete. Teams of the finest craftsmen had worked for years to create the master weights, the perfect examples that would serve as references for all others. These master weights had been distributed to every major city, carried by trusted officials who ensured their safe transport and proper installation in secure vaults, where they could be consulted whenever disputes arose. But the standardization was more than just a practical achievement. It was a philosophical statement about the nature of truth and fairness. By creating universal standards, the Harappan civilization had declared that there were certain absolute truths that transcended local customs and individual preferences. A weight was not just heavy or light, it was precisely this heavy, measurably and verifiably so, in ways that could be confirmed by anyone with the proper knowledge and tools. You see, Myra Cavey would say, his voice soft and contemplative, we are not just making weights, we are weaving the threads that hold our world together. Each weight carries with it a promise of fairness, of trust, of harmony between all who use it. The binary system they used was elegant in its simplicity. Each weight was precisely double or half of another, creating a perfect mathematical harmony. 1, 2, 4, 8, 16. The numbers flowed like a gentle river, each one connected to the next in an unbreakable chain of proportion. This mathematical precision had practical benefits that extended far beyond simple measurement. The binary progression meant that any desired weight could be achieved by combining just a few standard pieces. A merchant who needed to measure 7 units of something could use weights of 4, 2, and 1. Someone measuring 15 units could use weights of 8, 4, 2, and 1. The system was both efficient and elegant, minimizing the number of weights that needed to be carried while maximizing flexibility. The mathematical beauty of the system also had deeper philosophical implications. It demonstrated the Harappan understanding that the universe itself was built on mathematical principles, that beneath the apparent chaos and randomness of daily life lay patterns of perfect order and harmony. As the days passed in quiet rhythm, Mira learned not just the physical skills of her craft, but its deeper meaning. She came to understand that the weights were more than mere tools. They were symbols of their civilization, as commitment to order and fairness. In a world where trade was the lifeblood of society, where merchants traveled vast distances carrying precious goods, these small stones were the foundation of trust itself. This understanding came gradually, through countless small observations and insights. She noticed how merchants would examine weights carefully before agreeing to transactions, not because they distrusted the specific trader, but because they understood that their entire economic system depended on the reliability of measurements. She saw how disputes could be resolved quickly and amicably when both parties agreed to use certified weights, and how the same disputes could escalate into serious conflicts when measurement standards were unclear or contested. The weights were ambassadors of trust, carrying with them the reputation and integrity of their makers. When a merchant from a distant city accepted goods measured with Harappan weights, they were placing their faith not just in the individual trader. This was a profound responsibility, one that weighed heavily on the minds of all who participated in the craft. The finished weights were works of art as much as instruments of measurement. Each one bore subtle markings, tiny symbols that identified its maker and verified its accuracy. Some were perfect cubes, their edges sharp and true, their surfaces polished to a mirror finish that reflected light like still water. Others were cylindrical, smooth and pleasing to hold, their curved surfaces flowing seamlessly from one end to the other. The largest were shaped like truncated spheres, their curves fitting naturally in the palm of a merchant's hand. The artistic aspects of the weights were not mere decoration. They served important functional purposes as well. The smooth surfaces were easier to clean and less likely to accumulate dirt or moisture that could affect their accuracy. The pleasing proportions made them comfortable to handle during long sessions of measurement and counting. The distinctive shapes allowed for quick identification in busy marketplaces where speed was often as important as accuracy. Different types of goods required different types of weights. Precious metals and gems required smaller, more precise weights that could detect tiny variations in quantity. Liquids were measured with specially designed weights that took into account the effects of temperature and container shape on apparent volume. Each type of weight had its own aesthetic traditions and design conventions. Weights used for measuring gold were often made from the darkest, densest stones available, their somber appearance reflecting the gravity of their purpose. Weights for measuring spices might be carved from lighter-colored stones. In the evenings, when the workshop grew quiet and the last light faded from the windows, Kavi would teach Myra the testing rituals. They would use a balance scale, itself a masterpiece of bronze craftsmanship, to verify that each weight was perfect. The balance scale was perhaps the most sophisticated piece of equipment in the workshop. Its bronze beam had been cast in a single piece to ensure perfect uniformity, then carefully machined to achieve precise balance. The fulcrum was made from the hardest available metal, polished to reduce friction to an absolute minimum. The pans were shaped to provide maximum stability while remaining sensitive to the smallest variations in weight. Using the scale required its own set of specialized skills. The weights had to be placed gently to avoid creating vibrations that could affect the reading. The scale had to be perfectly level, checked regularly with a water-filled glass that showed even the tiniest deviation from horizontal. Temperature changes could affect the metal's expansion and thus the scale's accuracy. So measurements were typically taken at the same time each day when conditions were most stable. "Listen to the balance," Cavi would whisper. "It will tell you secrets that your eyes cannot see." And indeed, Mira learned to hear the subtle sounds, the whisper of bronze on bronze, as the beam found its center, the tiny settling sounds that indicated perfect balance had been achieved. She learned to distinguish between the quick, decisive movement of a perfectly balanced scale and the slow, uncertain oscillation that indicated a weight was slightly off. She could hear the difference between the clean, pure tone of properly adjusted bronze and the dull, muffled sound that warned of wear or damage in the mechanism. The testing process was more than just quality control. It was a ritual of verification that connected each new weight to the long chain of standards that stretched back to the original master weights. Every weight in the workshop could trace its accuracy through this unbroken lineage, each one certified by comparison with weights that had themselves been certified, in an endless chain of verification that ensured the integrity of the entire system. The workshop existed in a world of gentle routines and seasonal rhythms. In the spring, when the Indus River ran high with mountain snowmelt, new shipments of stone would arrive. The traders who brought them were often weary from their long journeys, and Myra would serve them cool water and fresh bread. While they rested in the workshop's courtyard, these spring arrivals were always exciting times. The long winter months had depleted their stocks of raw materials, and everyone in the workshop looked forward to seeing what new varieties of stone the traders had discovered. Sometimes there would be familiar types from known sources, their properties well understood, and their potential already mapped out in the craftsmen's minds. Other times there would be completely new materials, stones from distant lands that required careful study and experimentation before they could be incorporated into the workshop's repertoire. The courtyard where the traders rested was itself a masterpiece of Harappan engineering, paved with carefully fitted stones that allowed rainwater to drain quickly It was surrounded by covered walkways that provided shade during the heat of the day. A well in the center provided fresh water, its depth calculated to ensure a steady supply even during the driest seasons. Stone benches placed at regular intervals offered comfortable seating, while carefully positioned trees provided additional shade and helped cool the air through their natural transpiration. The traders who visited the workshop came from all corners of the known world. Some were locals who specialized in finding and transporting stones from quarries within a few days' journey of the city. Others were long-distance traders who followed routes that took them away from home for months at a time, traveling through mountain passes and across desert expanses to reach sources of materials that could be found nowhere else. Each trader had their own specialty, their own network of suppliers and customers. Some focused on the finest quality stones suitable for the most demanding applications. Others dealt in more common materials that were needed in large quantities for everyday use. Still others were explorers and innovators, always searching for new sources of materials or new types of stones that might offer advantages over existing options. The relationships between the workshop and these traders were built on trust and mutual benefit that had developed over many years. The traders knew that Kavi and his apprentices would pay fair prices for quality materials and would never try to cheat them or take advantage of their long journeys. The workshop, in turn, could rely on the traders to bring them the best materials available and to provide accurate information about the sources and properties of everything they delivered. During the monsoon season, when the rains drummed softly on the flat roofs and filled the air with the sweet scent of wet earth, the work would continue at a slower pace. The moisture in the air required extra care. Tools had to be dried and oiled more frequently, and finished weights were stored in special sealed containers to protect them from the humidity. The monsoon season brought its own unique challenges and opportunities to the workshop. The high humidity made it difficult to achieve the finest finishes on completed weights, as the moisture in the air would cause tiny particles of dust and debris to stick to polished surfaces. Tools required more frequent maintenance, as the damp conditions could cause metal parts to rust and wooden handles to swell or warp. But the monsoon season also brought benefits. The cooler temperatures made it more comfortable to work for long hours, and the steady sound of rain on the roof created a peaceful atmosphere that was conducive to concentration and meditation. The increased humidity also had some positive effects on certain types of stone, making them easier to work with and less likely to crack or chip during the shaping process. The workshop had been designed with the monsoon season in mind. Drainage channels built into the floors carried away any water that might seep in through the walls or windows. The roof was sloped to shed water quickly and effectively, with specially designed gutters that directed the flow away from the building's foundation. Windows could be shuttered during the heaviest rains, while still allowing adequate ventilation to prevent the accumulation of stale air and excessive humidity. During the longer nights of the monsoon season, the workshop often became a gathering place for the neighborhood. Craftsmen from other workshops would stop by to share news and discuss technical innovations. Merchants would visit to plan their strategies for the upcoming trading season. Sometimes musicians or storytellers would entertain the group, their voices blending with the rhythm of the rain to create memorable evenings of community and culture. The winter months brought their own special character to the work. The air was crisp and dry, perfect for the final polishing stages. Mira learned to use fine sand and soft cloths to bring each weight to a perfect finish. The process was hypnotic, the circular motions of polishing, the gradual emergence of the stone's natural beauty, the satisfaction of feeling rough edges become smooth and perfect. Winter was the season of completion and refinement. The dry air allowed for the finest finishing work, as dust and debris were less likely to stick to polished surfaces. The steady temperatures meant that tools and materials remained stable throughout the day, reducing the need for constant adjustments and the longer nights provided additional time for detailed work that required the steadiest hands and sharpest eyes. The polishing process was perhaps the most meditative aspect of the entire craft. Unlike the earlier stages, which required frequent decisions about cutting angles and shaping strategies, polishing was a matter of patient, repetitive motion. The craftsman would work in small circles, gradually covering the entire surface of the weight, building up layer upon layer of increasingly fine polish until the stone seemed to glow with inner light. Different types of stones required different polishing techniques. Some responded well to aggressive initial polishing with coarse sand, followed by progressively finer materials. Others needed gentler treatment throughout the entire process, requiring patience and delicate touch to avoid damaging their surfaces. The finest stones might require dozens of different polishing stages, each one bringing the surface closer to the perfect mirror finish that was the hallmark of master craftsmanship. The polishing materials themselves were carefully prepared and stored. Sand was sorted by grain size, with the finest particles reserved for the final stages of work. Cloths were woven from specially selected fibers that would not scratch delicate surfaces. Even the oil used to lubricate the polishing process was chosen for its purity and consistency, as any impurities could create flaws in the finished surface. As the years passed, Myra's skills grew and deepened. She learned to recognize the subtle differences between stones from different quarries, understanding how each type would respond to her tools. Some were hard but brittle, requiring gentle persuasion rather than force. Others were soft and forgiving, allowing for corrections if mistakes were made. This growing expertise was not just a matter of accumulating technical knowledge. It represented a fundamental change in how Mira approached her craft. Where once she had followed established procedures and relied on Kavi's guidance for every decision, she now began to develop her own intuitive understanding of the materials and processes involved in weight-making. She learned to read the subtle signs that indicated how a particular stone would behave under different conditions. The way light reflected from its surface could reveal internal stress patterns that might cause unexpected breaking. The sound it made when tapped could indicate its density and hardness. Even the way it felt in her hands, its temperature, its texture, its weight distribution provided important clues about its suitability for different applications. This intuitive knowledge was supplemented by careful observation and systematic experimentation. Myra began keeping detailed records of her work, noting which techniques worked best with which types of stone, which tools produced the finest results, which environmental conditions were most favorable for different stages of the process. Over time, these records became a valuable resource, not just for her own work, but for training future apprentices. The relationship between master and apprentice was built on patience and mutual respect. Kavi never hurried Mira's learning, understanding that true mastery could not be rushed. He had learned this lesson from his own master decades earlier, and he passed it on with the same gentle wisdom he had received. "The stone teaches us patience," he would say. "It has waited millions of years to become a weight. We can afford to wait a few hours to shape it properly." This philosophy of patience extended beyond the technical aspects of the craft to encompass the entire relationship between teacher and student. Kavi understood that learning was not just a matter of acquiring specific skills, but of developing the judgment, intuition, and character that would allow those skills to be used wisely and effectively. He taught by example as much as by instruction, demonstrating through his own work the attitudes and approaches that led to excellence. His movements were always deliberate and controlled, never hurried or careless. His attention to detail was unwavering. Whether he was working on a simple practice piece or a complex commission for an important client, his respect for the materials and tools of his craft was evident in everything he did, from the way he stored his chisels to the care with which he selected each stone. But Kavi also understood that each apprentice was unique, with their own strengths, weaknesses, and learning style. What worked for one student might not work for another. Some learned best through verbal explanation, others through visual demonstration, still others through hands-on experimentation. A good teacher needed to be flexible, adapting their methods to match the needs of each individual student. There was profound truth in this philosophy. In their civilization, haste was seen as the enemy of quality. Better to take time and create something perfect than to rush and produce something flawed. This attitude was reflected not just in individual craftsmanship, but in the broader social and economic structures that supported the artisan class. The economic system that supported the workshop was based on the recognition that quality craftsmanship required time and could not be rushed. Customers were willing to wait for weights that met the highest standards, understanding that inferior products would ultimately cost more through their unreliability and shorter lifespan. The guild system that governed the craft ensured that artisans received fair compensation for their work and were not pressured to compromise quality for the sake of speed or economy. This patient approach to craftsmanship had broader implications for Harappan society as a whole. It reflected a culture that valued excellence over efficiency, permanence over convenience, wisdom over cleverness. It was a worldview that saw the creation of beautiful, functional objects as a form of service to the community, and as a way of participating in the eternal order that governed the universe. The workshop was visited regularly by the city's trade inspectors, officials whose job it was to ensure that all weights met the strict standards. These visits were never stressful events, but rather occasions for sharing knowledge and maintaining connections with the broader community. The inspectors would examine random samples of weights, testing them against master standards that were kept in the city's central archive. The inspection process was thorough but respectful. The inspectors understood that they were dealing with master craftsmen whose integrity was beyond question, but they also understood that the reliability of the entire measurement system depended on regular verification and quality control. They would arrive at the workshop without prior notice, but their visits were always welcomed as opportunities for professional dialogue and mutual learning. The inspectors themselves were highly trained specialists who understood both the technical aspects of weight making and the broader economic and social implications of their work. Many had served apprenticeships in workshops like cavies before joining the inspection service, giving them deep appreciation for the skills and dedication required to produce weights of the highest quality. During their visits, the inspectors would not only test the accuracy of finished weights, but would also examine the tools and procedures used in their creation. They might observe the craftsmen at work, asking questions about new techniques or materials. They would review the workshop's records, checking to ensure that proper documentation was being maintained for all weights produced. These interactions were valuable for both sides. The inspectors gained insights into the practical challenges faced by working craftsmen, information that helped them refine their standards and procedures. The craftsmen in turn, learned about developments in other workshops and about broader trends in trade and commerce that might affect their work. Myra came to appreciate these visits as opportunities to learn about the broader world of trade and measurement. The inspectors would tell stories of distant markets, of merchants who traveled to far-off lands carrying goods that had been weighed with weights from their very workshop. Through these stories, Myra gained a sense of the vast scale and complexity of the trading networks that her work supported. She learned about the great caravans that carried goods across desert wastes, about the ships that sailed down the Indus River to ports on the Arabian Sea, about the mountain passes where traders from distant lands brought exotic goods to exchange for the products of Harappan civilization. Each story reinforced her understanding of the crucial role that accurate weights played in making all this commerce possible. Without reliable standards of measurement, these complex trading relationships would collapse into confusion and mistrust. The weights were not just tools, but the foundation upon which an entire economic system was built. The inspectors also brought news of innovations and improvements being developed in other parts of the civilization. New techniques for testing accuracy, new materials being used in weight construction, new designs that offered advantages in specific applications. This information was freely shared among all craftsmen, reflecting the Harappan understanding that improvements in quality and technique benefited everyone. One particularly memorable visit came from an elderly inspector named Vasant, whose own grandfather had been involved in establishing the original weight standards. He brought with him one of the original master weights, a piece so perfect and precisely made that it had served as a reference for generations. This weight, he told Mira, holding it up to catch the light, has probably verified thousands of others. It has traveled to every major city in our civilization, ensuring that fairness prevails in all our markets. The weight was beautiful in its simplicity, a perfect cube of dark stone, its surfaces polished to a mirror finish that seemed to hold depths of light within its crystalline structure. When Mira held it, she could feel the accumulated wisdom of generations of craftsmen who had touched it before her. The weight was not just a tool, but a sacred object that embodied the highest ideals of their craft. Vasant explained the history of this particular weight, how it had been created by a legendary master craftsman whose name was still spoken with reverence in workshops throughout the land. The process of creating the master weights had taken years, involving not just individual craftsmen, but teams of specialists who had worked together to achieve levels of precision that had never been equaled before or since. The creation of the master weights had been more than just a technical achievement. It had been a spiritual quest, a search for absolute perfection that transcended the merely practical needs of commerce. The craftsmen who worked on them had fasted and purified themselves, approaching their work with the same reverence that priests brought to their religious duties. This original weight had been tested and retested countless times, its accuracy verified through comparison with other master weights and through mathematical calculations that confirmed its perfect conformity to the theoretical ideal. It had been blessed by priests and certified by the highest authorities in the land before being placed in service as a standard for all future weights. As Mira's expertise grew, she began to specialize in the creation of the smallest weights, those used for measuring precious materials like gold dust and rare spices. These tiny weights required extraordinary precision, as even the smallest error would be magnified when measuring valuable goods. The transition to working with miniature weights represented a new level of challenge and responsibility, where errors in larger weights might result in minor disputes or small financial losses. Mistakes in precision weights could have serious consequences. A merchant who discovered that his gold had been measured with inaccurate weights might not only lose money on that particular transaction, but might lose trust in the entire system of measurement that governed his business. The tools required for this work were completely different from those used for larger weights. Instead of bronze chisels and wooden mallets, Mira worked with instruments that were barely larger than needles, made from the finest steel available and sharpened to points that could barely be seen with the naked eye. The workbench itself was different, smaller, more stable, equipped with magnifying devices that allowed for detailed examination of work that would otherwise be impossible to see clearly. The work was painstaking. Using tools barely larger than needles, she would shape weights no bigger than seeds, each one requiring hours of careful attention. The finished products were so small they had to be stored in special containers with individual compartments lined with soft cloth to prevent damage. Each tiny weight was a masterpiece of precision engineering. Despite their small size, they had to meet the same standards of accuracy as their larger counterparts. This meant that tolerances which might be acceptable in a weight measured in ounces became completely unacceptable in a weight measured in grains. The margin for error was so small that even the slightest deviation from perfect technique could ruin hours of careful work. The process of creating these miniature weights required not just technical skill, but extraordinary concentration and focus. The work had to be done in short sessions, as the intense attention required could not be sustained for long periods without fatigue setting in and compromising the quality of the results. Between work sessions, Myra would rest her eyes and hands, sometimes meditating or performing breathing exercises to maintain the calm, steady state of mind that the work required. Working with these miniature weights taught Myra new levels of concentration and mindfulness. She learned to control her breathing to avoid disturbing her work, to time her finest cuts to the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. The workshop would become absolutely silent during these delicate operations, with even Kavi moving carefully to avoid creating vibrations that might affect her precision. The environment in which this work was performed had to be carefully controlled. The slightest vibration could cause a tool to slip and ruin a nearly completed weight. Air currents had to be minimized to prevent dust particles from settling on work surfaces. Even the lighting had to be perfect, bright enough to see clearly, but not so bright as to create glare or harsh shadows that might hide important details. The timing of this work was also crucial. It was typically performed during the calmest parts of the day, when traffic in the streets was lightest and the building was most stable. Early morning hours were often preferred when the air was still and the craftsman's hands were steadiest. Weather conditions also played a role. Work on the finest weights was postponed on windy days or during thunderstorms, when atmospheric disturbances might affect the delicate balance required. The meditation of this work was profound. Hours could pass in what seemed like minutes as Mira lost herself in the careful shaping of these tiny masterpieces. Her mind would become perfectly still, focused entirely on the immediate task at hand, free from all other concerns and distractions. This meditative aspect of the work was not just a pleasant side effect, it was essential to achieving the level of precision required. The human hand, no matter how skilled, could not maintain the steadiness needed for this work unless the mind was completely calm and focused. Any distraction, any intrusion of external thoughts or concerns would immediately manifest itself in trembling or uncertainty that would compromise the quality of the work. Myra learned to enter this meditative state at will, using breathing techniques and mental exercises that had been passed down through generations of craftsmen. The ability to achieve this level of focus became one of her most valuable skills, applicable not just to her work with miniature weights, but to all aspects of her craft. The changing seasons brought different types of orders to the workshop. In autumn, when the harvest was complete and merchants prepared for the long trading season, there would be increased demand for larger weights used to measure grain and textiles. These weights had their own satisfying character, substantial and solid, reassuring to hold, designed to last for generations of use. The autumn season was always busy in the workshop, as merchants prepared for the intensive trading period that would follow the harvest. Grain merchants needed weights that could handle the large quantities involved in bulk transactions. Textile dealers required weights suitable for measuring cloth and thread. Metal workers needed specialized weights for their particular alloys and products. Each type of application required its own approach to design and construction. Grain weights needed to be large enough to measure substantial quantities efficiently, but not so large as to be unwieldy. They had to be durable enough to withstand rough handling in busy marketplaces, but precise enough to ensure fair transactions. The shapes were typically simple and functional, with broad, stable bases and smooth, worn edges from years of use. Many were carved from dense chert or granite, materials that resisted erosion and preserved their form through countless weighings. Some bore faint inscriptions, small notches, parallel lines, or drilled dots that corresponded to known units in the Harappan metrological system, a binary progression that allowed easy doubling and halving. In one corner of the workshop, under filtered light from a narrow skylight, weights for textiles were being polished. These were finer, more delicate pieces, small cuboids or spherical stones. Their surfaces sometimes tinted with mineral-based paints to distinguish their values. A merchant who traded dyed threads in Lothal had placed an urgent request, and the weightmaker's apprentice was carefully wrapping each stone in thin cloth before placing them in a cedar box. These weights, while modest in size, carried enormous value. A single mismeasurement could lead to days of profit lost or gained, depending on whose scale was trusted. Metalworking weights, however, demanded a stricter kind of precision. These were often used in tandem with tiny balances, the kind you might find in a jeweler's pouch or in the hands of a bronze caster testing ratios for an alloy. They were smaller than a thumbprint, yet no less important than their heavier counterparts. Each was tested against a master set kept under lock and seal, a lineage of standard weights passed down through generations. Though the work was methodical and slow, the weightmaker never rushed. Accuracy was more sacred than speed. Each tap of the chisel, each swirl of polishing sand, was a small act of devotion, not just to craftsmanship, but to society itself. For, in Harappa, as in all great cities, the weight was not merely a tool, it was a promise. By evening, as the streets outside quieted and the scent of cooking fires drifted in from the alleyways, the day's last weight was set aside to cool. The master stepped back from his bench and washed his hands in a bronze basin. He looked over the rows of finished pieces, some bound for traders, others destined for distant ports. Outside, bullock carts rolled by slowly, their wheels creaking under sacks of barley and bundles of cotton. Somewhere near the granary, a buyer and seller would soon kneel at a scale, placing their faith not in words but in stone, the silent, calibrated stones from this very room. And in that quiet between hammer and breath, the legacy of the Harappan weightmaker lived on. Subscribe and like.